So the topic for tonight is dealing with the impossible. I was thinking about this. I got an email earlier today from a guy who's really struggling with just the impossibleness of this all. Hasn't seen his kids for a long time. And it got me thinking about the beginning part of this, right? When you're in the beginning of the fight, and when I say beginning, 3 years can still be in the beginning depending on what you're dealing with. And I think by design, what toxic, narcissistic, high conflict exes want is to push you to your breaking point so that you give up. And they have a unique ability to find all the right buttons, all the right crazy scenarios to accomplish that goal. I know we've all dealt with that. And this, unfortunately, the holiday time of year, a lot of times this stuff starts around this time because it's just that much more painful to try to push you to a breaking point. Now, for me, one of the things that I really struggled with was holding on to what I thought should happen, but the fact that it didn't. I initially thought, there will be justice in court. The truth will set you free. Justice will be had. And I think most of us realize rather quickly that generally doesn't go that way. The only time maybe it goes that way is if you are so focused on what you're doing, you don't make any mistakes, and you basically come out guns a-blazing, so to speak. And I don't think anybody generally does that. The only people who generally do that are the toxic people who've been methodically planning this exit strategy from the beginning. And in the scenario that I was reading earlier today, it followed the normal playbook for these disasters. Meaning, starts out with the whole, things aren't working out. I need to take a break. I'm going to go out of state to stay with my parents. Typically what happens in those scenarios, and if you're in the beginning stages of this and anything sounds familiar, you need to not allow that to happen. You need to file something, unfortunately, before they leave. Because what typically will happen in those scenarios is they leave, they establish a residency in this new location, then they file, and now you're basically scrambling. And typically the way this plays out, and I've seen this time and time again, then you immediately file. Now you have your case in state A and their case in state B, and you have a conflict. And what's even worse is the kids are physically in the other location. So you're fighting a losing battle. And then what ends up normally happening is they come up with some type of allegation of abuse to try to facilitate their case. Now, this didn't happen in my scenario. Well, it was attempted, but it didn't happen, right? I mean, as soon as things degraded, fortunately, I had enough, experience in these scenarios, heard enough from other people who had been victims of this strategy that I knew as soon as the marriage was falling apart, I filed because, at least in the state of California, as soon as you file, there's a temporary restraining order preventing anybody from moving, spending money. Basically, you can't, it's like she couldn't just get up and leave with the kids. And I understand the struggles with that because you're trying to, in the initial part of it, you don't know the war that you're fighting. Again, you're dealing with the impossible. So you're trying to save your marriage, not realizing it's over and you're playing checkers and they're playing chess and they're like 9 moves ahead of you. Then the other thing that typically happens is you get caught up in this seeking justice and expecting things to happen, or trying to force things into your own box, so to speak. I did have that issue. Things are supposed to be this way. This is the way it's supposed to happen. They're not going to, the court's not going to allow, X, Y, Z. Then you realize that, yes, they will. I kind of laugh about it right now, but I mean, it was incredibly traumatic, incredibly stressful. You're dealing with the impossible scenario. Everything that you've focused your energy and time on is fundamentally obliterated in a moment. Everything that you worked toward that was important to you, your family, your wife, your spouse, your kids, your job, your sanity, slowly, reputation, let me add that in there, slowly gets stripped away from you. And you're left trying to just figure out what's going on. And you're trying to navigate this system, trying to and are hoping for an outcome that has some accountability to the other person, which for some crazy reason generally doesn't happen early on. It typically will happen years down the road, but it isn't immediate. And unfortunately, these people are masters at manipulating the court systems to prolong this nightmare. All the while, you're basically reaching your breaking point. Fundamentally, I think the challenge is responding differently. What I mean is recognizing when you're beating your head against the wall and saying, okay, I have to do something different. And I had to do this. My scenario really in comparison to, like the one I was just mentioning, I was close to that happening. Don't get me wrong. But I had 50-50 custody. I had fundamentally the best scenario that you can accomplish in these nightmares. Well, let me back up. When I say best, the typically realistic. Obviously the best would be for the courts to hold the other person accountable in a way that just drives home the point that you are not going to be, or they are not going to be empowered by this circus. But again, unfortunately, that typically doesn't happen. So best case scenario, or the realistic scenario, you accomplish 50-50 custody. You're dealing with somebody who won't follow the court order and you're beating your head against the wall, and unfortunately, like in my situation, I was making mistakes with my kids, not realizing that if I just maintained stability and gave them the best, calmest scenario, it would pay dividends in the long run. It's just really hard to do when you're being attacked constantly. Now, if you make some positive gains, then it makes it a little bit easier, but don't get me wrong. It is still incredibly tough. There were some really dark days in the early part of this. There were times where I didn't think I was going to make it through this. And that's where that responding differently, thinking differently is really critical. Because if you keep focusing on the same things, you're not going to make any progress. You're going to drive yourself farther and farther down. And this basically comes to the end point of this, which is you have to find a way to take your life back. Not give up on your life, but take it back. And, if you have time with your kids, okay, fine. But even if you don't, you have to find a way to where this doesn't destroy you. Because if you don't change the way you respond to this, it will absolutely taint every part of your life. Now, it's going to taint your life. It has tainted mine. It has affected it. It has changed the trajectory of where I thought, and I'm sure where you thought you were going to go in life, what you expected to happen, the scenario you played out in your head. But you can't just give in to that. Now, to be clear, this part of this, which I think is probably the most difficult in dealing with this, and it took me a significant amount of time. If you've watched some of my older videos, you probably heard me talk about this. I came into a scenario where I'm like, oh my God, I have to change what I'm doing or this is going to kill me. And even when I reached that point, it wasn't like I had that epiphany and the next day I was able to put a plan in action and make that work. It took months. And I will also add that as I was trying to make that epiphany, I was spiraling into a pit of hell. This ultimately comes down to perseverance and you making decisions to try to pull yourself out of it. For me, what I realized I had to do is I had to stop constantly thinking and ruminating about the situation. That's really hard to do when you're constantly being reminded of the situation. Even though I had my kids, it was like every time they came over, it was like the ex was with them. They were parroting the same comments that she used to make. Every 2 weeks when I would get my paycheck and it would be obliterated, and I'm looking going, I don't have money to pay the light bill, the electric bill. Or it's like, how am I going to put food on the table? How am I going to put gas in the, and those were really tough times because every day it's a reminder. Now, don't get me wrong. In retrospect, it was easier than, if I was sitting there and all my money was gone and the kids were out of state and I never heard from them. But even in that scenario, you still have to find a way to take your life back. All right, 15 minutes into this. Do not let these motherfuckers destroy your life. At the end of the day, we can say, you know what? I'm going to let my attachment to this go, and I am going to find anything that will give me joy and peace in my own life. And that's what you have to do. You have to do it. And it's possible. And if you, hold on, let me see if I can pull this up. If you are new to this and you go to my main YouTube channel, Dad Surviving Divorce, if you're listening to this on Spotify, there's a channel on YouTube called Dad Surviving Divorce, where there are videos. If you scroll down on the main page, you will see a playlist called Mindset for Narcissistic Abuse Recovery. And these videos build on each other to help give you the skills and the knowledge to be able to deal with this and to understand what's going on. The first video, Hybrid No Contact, is whenever you do have children and you're trying to quote unquote co-parent. Absolute thinking for whenever you're trying to, you're going over and over again, like, why is this happening? That's a technique to help you put this in a little box to where you understand that you're dealing with somebody who has some serious problems. And then black hole thinking, the reason that, I mean, the first 3 videos are super important. And black hole thinking, the importance of that video is you have to stop thinking about what's going on with the other person. You don't need to be thinking about their trip to Bermuda, and when the kids come over and they say, oh, this is what we did. It was so great. We did this and that, and you're thinking to yourself, I can't even afford to, buy everybody top ramen. It's tough. It's tough, but it can be done. Hang in there. Hang in there. Do not give up and start prioritizing your own sanity, even though this feels impossible.